Okay, we are now recording.
Okay, cool. Hey everyone. Welcome to the March edition of the Presto Foundation Technical Steering Committee meeting. So we have just one agenda item for today, and it is about the Conformance Program that we briefly talked about in the last TSC meeting. And we have Steve Winslow from Linux Foundation today to talk about it and maybe share what it means and some details about some details about how other open source projects do it. And maybe we can also talk about like the role of the TSC and the governing board in this whole process. So Steve, you are ready to go next?
Yeah, happy to dive in, Nessie, and thanks for the invite. Good to meet you all, and happy to talk with you today about this. So, yeah, so I guess what would be helpful? Should I just start with a quick overview of like what conformance programs are, like how we use them at the LF, and we can kind of go from there with questions that folks have?
Yeah, that would be good. Like starting from basics and wrapping up with questions would be great.
Yeah, cool. Sounds good. Yeah, so let's see. So kind of the overview of conformance programs, really what the idea is that for our open source projects, the project has its own identity, it has its code base, and so for something like Presto, when we're talking about Presto, we're talking about the Presto project. But we know that downstream users, downstream redistributors, whether they're vendors or commercial companies or other organizations or kind of or other communities, kind of anyone who's downstream is going to want a way to be able to talk about their own implementation of something, their repackaging of Presto or their distribution of it or whatever. And this is the same thing we see in our other open source projects. And so what we do is we want to make clear that that the open source project is what it is, and the downstream distributions are their own thing. But we want to have a way for them to be able to communicate the fact that they are compatible or interoperable, or kind of what exactly it is depends on the technical situation of the project. But basically, be able to communicate to their customers and to their users that they are interoperable with the upstream open source project. And so the way that we've typically seen projects do that is by creating a conformance program and a conformance definition around that. And the idea there is that on the technical side, the folks who are building the open source project basically sit down and define what it means for something to be conformant in the context of their own project. So that could mean, and again, this is where the specifics vary quite a bit depending on the technology, the context in which the project's being used, all of that. But but conformant or interoperable or something like that could mean could be in the sense of something like API compatibility. So at the open source project level, the project defines a set of APIs. If a downstream redistribution of it satisfies all the same API contracts, returns the expected results, does the expected things, then that could be what that project defines as conformant. In other cases, I've seen projects where it's looking more at something like plugins. It's that they want to communicate that downstream redistributors are creating plugins intended for use with the open source project, and those plugins need to meet a certain set of criteria or certain technical definition in order to be able to pass as conformant. And the idea is that what this does is then so the conformance program is kind of the operational process of how all of this happens. But what essentially happens is that those downstream products or services typically will run through some sort of either self-tests, or can be anything ranging from self-tests up to like third-party testing labs, but something on that spectrum, to be able to demonstrate that they are conformant, that they comply with that conformance definition. And then if they are, then they typically, in exchange for demonstrating that they're conformant, they can then get the right to be able to use the conformance trademarks as part of their marketing. So typically that'll be something like a badge that says, Presto conformant, or something like that, that indicates the version number that they're conformant with. And then they can use that in their marketing. They can use that on their product. They can basically use that as a way to communicate to their customers that, yes, we are interoperable. And if you are using our product, then you can trust that it meets all of the different conformance criteria. So it's basically a way of helping the ecosystem to be able to stay interoperable with one another, while still enabling people to kind of build their own products, build their own product offerings, and make them available. So nothing, and I'll pause in a second and let folks ask questions, but just one other piece to this. This is all kind of built around the trademarks and the trademark for the conformance, whether that mark would be Presto conformant or some similar phrase similar to that, and then a badge based on that. All of this, so the open source project, just like any other open source project, has its own open source license. And so anybody is absolutely free at any time to take code under that license and use it in whatever ways they want, kind of as long as they're complying with the requirements of that license. This is a little bit adjacent to that, because this is saying, okay, how do you demonstrate, if you're participating in this conformance program, how do you demonstrate that your downstream offering still conforms with that definition that the community is using to say, here is what it means to be conformant. And if you do demonstrate that conformance, then you get to use the mark in your offering, and then customers can trust that you'll be interoperable with that definition. So let me pause there. Does that make sense? Do folks have questions just about that at the high level?
I do. So when you have a conformance program, people are allowed to use some designated version of the mark. What are the people who are not conformant allowed to do?
So the trademark guidelines that we have in place for LF projects spell out what people are allowed to do and to not do with the trademarks. And so that'll be, so this is one thing where I probably should have said this at the beginning, but so I am an attorney with the LF. So there are going to be things here where I can't really get into things that are going to be legal advice or legal questions like that. So when it comes to things like what can someone do with the trademarks under the trademark usage guidelines, that's going to be the sort of thing where they'd want to talk with their own legal counsel about the trademark usage guidelines that apply, and just understand how that fits with their use case. So there are some things in the trademark usage guidelines that talk about using marks to refer to the project, to the open source project itself, about using the marks within the bounds of things like concepts like trademark fair use. So there are some things in the guidelines that go into those sort of topics. All of that is kind of parallel, but to the side of the conformance program, because the conformance program is really focusing on that conformance mark itself. Does that make sense?
Yeah. So really, what we're discussing is we're creating a new category. There's all the other, like, this thing is already kind of prohibited, right? So we're actually creating a new category for people to use by having a conformance. Okay.
That's right. Yeah, we're essentially creating you could think of it as a new trademark. It's, it'll incorporate the Presto branding into it, but it'll be a new trademark that in order to get the license to use this conformance mark, you get that license by participating in the conformance program and demonstrating that your products or services are conformant.
Okay.
So other questions at this point?
I got one question.
It's
a little bit of a high level question. So I think conformance can be defined, like there may be a spectrum of definitions, like you mentioned, like it can be very, very strict. Like I can say, oh, you should only use my release and nothing else. Or it can be very flexible and I can define some compatibility tests or other, self-service tests, whatever, like similar to how other projects do it. Like, have you seen any examples around these two extremes? And from this spectrum point of view, like, do you have any data points, like how the strictness play out in the long term for the community? Like any downside and upside you have observed that you can share around this spectrum?
Yeah, I think so. A couple things. I think for the LF projects that I've worked on this with, I haven't really seen them. I don't think I've seen any go in the direction of, you can only use the exact binary or the exact code that comes out of the project. Like typically, I don't think I've seen projects do that. And I think one of the reasons for that is that it's kind of a handful of things around, but I think one of the limitations is that it really kind of restricts what downstream, restricts what downstream people can do with the project. It really kind of puts a limit on what sorts of features or functionality or that sort of thing that people could build into the product and still into their own product and still be conformant. I think what we've seen is that when there's some, when there's greater flexibility than that, I think part of what having a conformance program does is that it helps bring more people into the community, not just to become conformant, but also to be contributing things back into the project, because it kind of helps establish that cycle of, here is, the project is where kind of shared development is happening. As people create further extensions to it or create other expansions, it's going to be to the value of in order for them to stay conformant. If they're veering too far from the conformance definition, then it's going to be to their benefit to be contributing those extensions back to the project, so they get taken up and built into the kind of the next version's conformance definition. So there is that kind of interplay that you're talking about, where you don't want it to be too restrictive, because it kind of prevents people from being able to do further development and experimentation with the project. I think on the other end, you don't want it to be too loose of a definition, because the real purpose of it and the real focus usually for projects is kind of with an eye towards the end users. So you want whoever the kind of downstream end users are, like the people out in the ecosystem who are looking to, they know that they want to use Presto, they want to use a distribution of Presto, and they're looking to understand, okay, if I use a distribution, what sort of guarantees am I getting that it will be compatible with another distribution of Presto if I decide to pick up my workloads and carry them somewhere else? And so having the conformance definition is really aimed towards those end users in particular, because now they can know, okay, if this distribution is marking themselves as being Presto conformant, then I can trust that they have gone through the conformance testing, and that at least for whatever APIs are in scope or whatever other commitments are in scope, that they've demonstrated that they're conformant with that. And so if I were to have to pick up my workloads and go to a different distribution that is also Presto conformant, then at least for that bound of whatever's in scope, I can trust that it'll be the same from one to another. Is any other questions at this point, or I can start getting into some more of the specifics if you'd like. So I'm not seeing anyone come off mute. So, so the way that this typically works. So I know it sounded like there were a couple of questions around kind of what happens at the governing board level versus what happens at the TSC level. And so the way that conformance programs are set up is that they're referred to in the governing board charter. So it's kind of within the scope of the governing board's responsibilities to manage, among other things, establishing conformance programs and actually here I will drop this link into the chat so that folks can see it. But so here, on the link that I just dropped in, that's the participation agreement. But if you scroll down to, that's the participation agreement that has the charter built into it. But if you go to here, you know what? Sorry, I will just screen share and that'll be a lot easier. Bear with me 1 second. Okay, here. Okay, so this is in the Presto directed fund charter. And so for the governing board in section 3, for the governing board, among the responsibilities that they have is overall management of the directed fund, including establishing any conformance programs and soliciting input, including testing tools from the TSC for defining and administering any programs related to conformance with the technical project. So kind of a bunch of words there, but basically what that means is that because the trademark Presto, and then whatever would be the conformance mark, Presto conformant, something like that, those trademarks are essentially assets that are overseen by the LF and the directed fund. And so kind of the process of establishing the program as a whole is something that is done by the governing board. But the whole kind of the details of, okay, whether it's which APIs or which features or functionality or kind of any of the technical details of how that happens, the governing boards typically are going to be looking to the TSC to be making all of those decisions. So kind of in the same way that the TSC is developing is collaboratively developing the project software itself, kind of the same thing for the conformance definitions, that it's going to be the TSC together, working through the details of what's in scope, what's out of scope. So with the governing board, part of what we do is, from the LF side, we have a set of terms and conditions that we've templates that we've developed over the years that we use with that we've used with multiple projects that have established conformance programs. And so those are something that we would be putting in place and would basically be the terms that any downstream redistributors that want to participate in the conformance program, they would be signing a participation form and basically signing up to those terms and conditions. So that's kind of, when I talk about the programmatic side of it, like of the conformance program, that's typically what I'm talking about, is that process of establishing those terms and conditions, folks coming and signing the participation form, and then going through the process of demonstrating their conformance. So then there's technical specifics of what does conformance mean? How do people demonstrate it? That sort of thing. That's what is basically within the scope of the TSC to sort out. So there was that mention in there of things like testing tools. And so one way that we've seen some projects do this, and so certified Kubernetes is one example here, that what they've done is on the Kubernetes side, they've developed kind of a whole basically self-test suite. And so what happens is, for someone who wants to participate in the certified Kubernetes program, the way that works is they go and grab that test suite. The test suite is also an open source project itself. It's up there on GitHub. People go and get it. They run it on their own distribution of Kubernetes, and it runs the whole set of tests that the Kubernetes community has decided to include in their definition. It creates a self-test report, and then the participants actually just upload that, submit a pull request to the conformance repo that includes the copy of the self-test reports. And so that's their way of handling it, so that they are publicly like anyone who's participating is publicly demonstrating that they have passed the tests by submitting those self-test results. And then they have some automation that they've built to receive the test results and ensure and check and confirm that they're all correct. But other projects have done it other ways. We've had some that have gone kind of less, I would say, less controlled than that. So we've had some that, to get started kind of very early on, have had more of a self-assertion sort of process. So it's more like, instead of having a test suite that runs and actually confirms that the criteria are met, instead it's basically a check the box. People are just asserting, the participant is asserting, yes, I comply with these different criteria. Typically, that may be a way for projects to get started. I think that's less encouraged. I think partly because it leaves some more room for subjectivity. I think typically we've seen these sort of programs be more successful where it can be as objective as possible. So as clear that it's kind of a yes, no, you passed or you didn't, based on you ran the automated test and they passed or they didn't. So I think typically we've seen projects be more successful with this, where they are closer to that kind of, here are the tests, you run them yourself. And then kind of on the other extreme, we've had projects that have gone in the direction of, they'll work with one or more third-party labs, and there's actually a third-party lab who comes in and runs the test themselves against the participants' distribution. And that, that's certainly also an option. I think that tends to be a more heavyweight sort of process, and really, depends on the context that the project's operating in, whether that's called for or not. But so that's that is sort of the spectrum of what the process for demonstrating your conformance, a participant's conformance, looks like. And then when you get into the specifics of, okay, what is the conformance definition in the first place? That's really where I'm going to be kind of outside of my out of my depth to be weighing in on that myself. I'll be honest, I'm not, other than the very highest level, I'm not familiar with any of the technical details of Presto. So I think that's where, for you all and for or for others in the community who are interested in participating in the conformance program, that's where it's really kind of in your hands to decide what's going to be within scope and what are those specific definitions going to be. So yeah, so let me pause there. Any other, I guess, any questions about any of that?
I have one question about like how other projects maintain their conformance definitions. Like I can think like they are probably not set in stone, like systems evolve, there may be changes. Like how is that typically maintained? I can see like some upsides to it, like you need to keep it, you know, up to date with your system, but at the same time, it's not a good of an experience for vendors. Like they have to reconform again and again, like if you did frequently. Like, do you have any examples or data points on how this go either way?
Yeah, good, very good questions. So, so a couple different facets to that. So I think one is just in terms of who is maintaining the. So this is not directly what you're asking, but I think related to it. In terms of who is maintaining the definition over time, you know, that could be the TSC as a whole. It could be something like a conformance working group that's set up to just be the folks who are particularly interested in that topic. It could be kind of any, you know, just in terms of who is doing it, it could be any kind of coordinated set of that, but it's typically up to the TSC to decide how it wants to organize itself and organize the folks who are going to be focused on that. So that's not directly the question you're asking, but I want to throw that in there. But I think in terms of kind of how often are changes made and how are those handled by vendors, I think what we've typically seen has been, yes, definitely the definition will change over time as the project software itself evolves. So it's not something that's going to be fixed and static forever. It is something that'll change. And I think that also a little bit goes to the question you were asking earlier about should it be just like it is exactly bit for bit binary compatible or the same as the binaries that are distributed. I think typically we've seen projects want to do if they're having frequent releases, if they're having very frequent releases of the project's source code or build artifacts or something like that, typically they'll want to have the conformance definition be updated less frequently than that, because I'm not sure what Presto's sort of release cadence is, but if a new Presto release was coming out every 2 weeks or something, then requiring vendors to be keeping their own distributions of it kind of up to date with the conformance definition every 2 weeks or something is not going to be something that they're really reliably able to handle, I'm guessing is going to be the case. So typically what we've seen is more, there's some kind of slower cadence than that, whether it's every quarter or every half a year or every year or something, but there's something on that order of cadence when new basically versions of the conformance definition come out. So for some projects like Kubernetes, again, is one example here. For them, I believe they have a new release of Kubernetes itself every 3 to 4 months, something like that. And so I think there they have tied the conformance program definitions to the same versions, just because that is when the 3 to 4 months they've found to be a kind of workable time to update for their participants. But the other piece of it is that I think I'd have to look at exactly how they're doing it, but for Kubernetes, I think it's basically anyone who is participating has to be conformant with, if they want to continue to describe themselves as conformant, they have to stay conformant with either the most current version released or the most current version -1. So basically it's kind of people have to continue rolling forward, but there is a little bit of time for, there is some amount of time for people to kind of do the updates they need to do to stay conformant, so that it's not just on the day that the release comes out, everybody has to flip the switch or else they're no longer conformant. So there are adjustments in there, there are ways of looking at it that can line up with whatever Presto's sort of release cadence is. But I think that's the way to be thinking about it, is what's going to be a reasonable length of time for vendors to be updating their own distributions to the newer versions, while at the same time still making sure that it's not so long that basically that end users out in the ecosystem are finding that they're stuck on an older version of a Presto distribution, but thinking that they're going to be conformant with the newer one, or vice versa. So did that answer your questions? I think I kind of jumped around a bit there. So
that was useful. Thank you.
Okay.
Any other questions for Steve?
Hopefully not too much of a topic shift. Is the TSC allowed to make exceptions to the performance program?
It's a good question. When you say exceptions, I guess what are you thinking there, if I can ask? Like,
so let's say we had a requirement in the conformance program that someone had to roll out a new release based on a Presto release over some cadence, like Kubernetes does. But there's some vendor that isn't able to do that because of, let's say they have too many private changes. So like, and then there's probably, let's say there's multiple vendors in the ecosystem that have this problem. And can the TSC do one and then not another? And I'm not saying it's a good idea, but yeah.
I think so. A couple good questions. So I think a couple things. One is that the kind of a core piece of this working and being functional is really the idea of vendor neutrality, and really having it be something. And that's partly where the like subjectivity versus objectivity comes in. So kind of the more that the definition and the way that it's demonstrated, the more that can be just tied to specific objective criteria, the better, because that's going to be, you know, something that just steers away from the questions of are people playing favorites, or there is one person getting treatment that another isn't, or something like that. So I think when it comes to exceptions for like particular vendors, I think that would be something that would probably be difficult or problematic, because it's going to raise questions of that sort of favoritism. I think now, but I think where more of what you're talking about though around, if it's an issue that like multiple people and, you know, multiple different vendors in the ecosystem are all seeing the same sorts of issues on one particular area, I think if that's something where there isn't really, I mean, to me, and you know, this is kind of in a vacuum, but to me, that would kind of suggest to me that there isn't yet consensus or kind of alignment on the way that this particular thing should be handled. And so that to me more suggests that particular topic area probably isn't ripe to include in the conformance definition, if that makes sense. So rather than saying like it's an exception for this or that vendor, it's more the scope of the conformance definition doesn't address this area yet, because we're finding that it isn't kind of ripe for inclusion. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So anything else? Any other questions? Or I guess anything that I haven't covered yet that you're wondering about for all this?
Steve, I know a question that's come up a lot is how long it takes to build a conformance program.
Yep. Yep, and that kind of, again, two answers to that. So I think one is on the programmatic side. So in terms of like how like things I was talking about earlier with putting the terms and conditions in place, putting the kind of all the padding around it, like the process and the padding and that sort of thing. I think that can be done fairly quickly, because that's largely based on templates that we've built up with other projects. So kind of the operational side of putting it in place, I think, is something that we can do fairly quickly once more of the technical decisions have been made. So once once there's greater alignment on what is the conformance definition going to be, what's in scope, you know, what does it mean to be conformant, and then the other piece being how will people demonstrate conformance? Like, will there be a test suite like this, that sort of thing? Figuring out the answers to those pieces on the technical side is typically where I think more of the time and the effort is going to be around. Because I think once there's alignment on those pieces, the kind of the other aspects of it are going to be quicker to roll out. In terms of this, so then to, you know, how long does it take on the technical side? I think that is really kind of a question of how much is going to be in scope. Like, is it going to be a kind of, and again, here I know I'm talking about APIs a lot. I don't know if this is the right way to think about it for Presto or not, but something like if every API is part of Presto is in scope for the conformance program, if every one of those has to be tested for every possible test case as part of the, you know, a self-testing suite or something like that, I can see where that would take quite a bit longer for the community to build up versus if it's something that is a more, a narrower scope of things initially for the initial rollout of the conformance program, that can be easier to get off the ground. So it's really, I think, again, the focus should be thinking of it from the perspective of an end user. What is going to be the most important to them to be able to say, this thing that I'm using is a distribution of Presto, so that I have that reliability of knowing that when I'm using Presto, I'm getting the expectations that I should have with that. That's kind of what I would use as the guiding star. And then I think from that, use that to figure out, okay, what are the core pieces that would absolutely need to be in place to kind of get this off the ground as an idea of having, the mark Presto conformant be meaningful to the ecosystem. And then over time that can evolve, that can grow. But I think that's kind of the lens to look at it through.
Cool. And thanks, Steve. Could you speak to, is there anything left the board needs to do, or is there anything a TSC needs, or can those TSC, are they free to start working on this today if they want to?
Yeah, I mean, the TSC is free to start working on this, start talking about it, and to start figuring out the details of what would they want to have in scope. All the things I said before. Yeah, any of that, the TSC can certainly go ahead and start working on. Yeah, and then I think in terms of with the governing board, like I've had a similar conversation to this with the governing board folks and kind of talk through what the program looks like. I think, I think next steps will probably be communication between the TSC and the governing board about what's the status, where, what's the direction that the technical community is looking at for it, and then kind of what do we think that means in terms of being in a position to start rolling it out. Ariel, I see you came off mute. Did you? Sorry, not trying to put you on the spot. Just didn't know if you had a question from before.
I did not mean to come off mute. I think it caught my typing.
No worries. No worries. Cool. Well, anything else? Anything else I can help with?
I don't see anyone coming off mute. Oh, well, if there's nothing else for Steve, thank you, Steve, for helping. It's a ton of information and super helpful. I have a lot of notes from you that I'll share with the TSC, and I think we had some links that you shared with previously that we'll make sure go out as well.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you, Gail. That was the last piece I was just going to mention was, we have some, I can point, I think I've shared with you some links to other projects and what they've done. And so, if you can share that out with the group, that'd be perfect.
Yeah. Thank you, Steve. This was very useful. Thanks for joining.
Sure. No, happy to. So good to meet you all.
Yeah, thank you very much. So we've been through the agenda, and so it was a good discussion, and we have no other items, so we can wrap it up here. And if you want to continue the discussion, we can continue it over the mailing list from this point on in the TSC mailing list. So the next steps is we are gonna, currently I've been having discussions with the folks in the TSC around the high level direction that we want to take for the conformance program. And I am almost done. Once I have set the high level direction, I guess we can start a working group similar to how other projects do it, and kick it off executing that direction and getting into the weeds. So with that, thank you, Steve, again for joining, and thank you all for joining as well. And until next time, take care, and we'll see each other next month.
Thank you,
Bye-bye.
everyone. Thanks.